and welcome to everyone today to the fourth and final meeting of Delivering International English Literature. And thank you for those who've returned and welcome to those who are new. We'll be going through a series of activities today, and it will be mainly presented on a slideshow. At certain points, you will need to access or look at Script A and Script B. And those are currently in the resources section, which you can find if you follow the 3 dots on Zoom. If you follow the More menu to resources, you should be able to find Script A and Script B there. But don't worry, because we'll not be needing those just yet. But if you do have a problem, Hansel should be able to help you locate those documents. So without further ado, I'll begin and welcome once again to those of you who are joining us today at Pearson. Okay, so we are looking, as we said, at the paper 4, and we're thinking about looking at the assessment. So how we can best help candidates meet those objectives successfully. We're going to follow the format that we have used in the previous weeks, looking at recent question paper questions, thinking about candidate responses and honing in on particular assessment objectives, and possibly using this time to share some strategies for teaching. Looking through the papers, we're going to think about both approaches and feedback from previous exam series. And hopefully, as we said, there will be a chance to share some ideas. So once again, welcome to Pearson today. And we are a company who are the UK's largest awarding organisation and recognise qualifications being delivered to over 3.5 million students globally a year with a long heritage, as you can see. Some general information about the course. Often we will say that this course builds on the earlier GCSE or IGCSE qualification, although we do know that some students do come to it from other areas and other lines of study. And for those who do deliver the UK qualification, there's certainly some similarities, and some texts and resources are interchangeable. And throughout, the knowledge and skills are blended in an integrated way. And we'll look a bit further at what that means in terms of preparing students for the assessments or looking at how the work is assessed. This is a modular qualification. Some students do take it just to AS and then stop, and others follow the 2-year pathway, but it can be flexible. Reminding ourselves of where we've been so far, we have equal weighting across the 4 units, and today we're particularly focusing in on Shakespeare and pre-1900 poetry. We're looking at this open book examination of 2 hours with our Shakespeare for section A and our pre-1900 poetry for section B. And as we had with unit 3, there is a slight shift in weighting on this paper compared to the AS, with slight heavier weighting onto the section B. But what we must remember when we say that is it still is a holistic qualification. And what we mean by that is that we are not allocating a particular number of marks for a particular AO. We're looking at the candidate's performance across their script, and we are thinking about weighing up and finding a best fit. And we'll be looking at that today. So thinking once again about how this will relate, we've had the AS in previous meetings and the totals and how they add up to the qualification. And then here are the weightings for the 2-year course for those of you following the full advanced level. So looking at paper 4, we are working across our AOs, and the nature of this is that the comparison is being looked at elsewhere, but we're looking at the idea of a deep dive into the Shakespeare and then working with the particular poetry collection that you have chosen. We're trying to get this idea of understanding the headline of the performance objectives so that we can think about how consistency is achieved across different qualifications in this subject, across many specifications and beyond our own. We're looking at fairness. We're hoping that it will be clear in how the assessment objectives appear in a student response and how they are credited. We're thinking about the validity, so that markers will be coming to fairly similar marks, fairly similar levels, and it gives us a common reference point, whether it be the candidate, the teacher, the examiner, or the person writing and setting the papers. So today's focus is Shakespeare and pre-1900 poetry. And just to recap once again, it is an open book exam, so the candidates will have access to the text, but it must be clean. We have section A and B. We have that slight weighting, as we mentioned before, towards the section B for the pre-1900 poetry. We have there our current list of set texts that the candidates will choose from. And again, format as we've had on many of the other papers, the candidate is provided with 2 questions for the play and they must choose one. Likewise, when working with their pre-1900 poetry anthology, they'll be working with metaphysical, the romantic or Victorian verse, and they will be working with specified poems, so as set for the particular life of the qualification. And as with section A, there will be 2 options and the candidate will choose one. So if we consider Shakespeare first, and for those of you who have been in the previous meetings, there are certainly commonalities with the AS study of Shakespeare. And we're thinking about talking about drama as a form of text and the types of techniques that the writers employ. So we may be looking at characterization. We're certainly considering the form and structure and how it affects our understanding of meaning. So we may, for example, consider a tragic arc. We're thinking about imagery and symbols and motifs in particular texts. We're certainly looking at language choices, although we will be returning to that point with a word of caution about the danger of sticking with solely word level work, but things also that are common to many texts, such as theme, tone, mood, and the idea that this is a piece to be performed. So where relevant, there may be mention of, in terms of Shakespeare, if not a stage direction, possibly an implied stage direction through dialogue, and any element of stagecraft that we feel is relevant to a particular example. We're hoping the candidates will think about how the dramatic form shapes the meaning, and they're keeping in mind the response of the audience at all times. So it is the sense of how particular language works, but also how particular points of conflict work and how Shakespeare has shaped the text to shape response. We're looking for critical and creative responses. So we want to see the candidate's personal interpretation, but informed by their critical understanding. That may involve talking about how context may influence meaning. So that deeper understanding of where the text has come from, either in terms of contemporary ideas surrounding the themes of the text or how the play was originally received. And sometimes there is a relevance in comparing with maybe differences of the modern reception. We can think about audiences and readers, plural, as we move through both sections today, and how the attitudes and values are presented in the texts and how then they may be engaged with. Throughout, we're looking for fluent communication with accuracy and this idea of effective conveyance of knowledge. And that sometimes can come down to discrimination, knowing which examples to select and how those examples may be relevant to supporting a particular argument. We're hoping that candidates will use their literary critical concepts, and we're thinking about accurate use and accurate reference to texts and sources. And this was discussed in a previous meeting as well. And we're not sort of requesting that the students be historians or fully across academic literature, but sort of a degree of accuracy, certainly in terms of timing and range. A question that was asked across units is how we deal with and how we teach these texts. And particularly as we get to the final unit, there is the possibility that there is an element of front loading because they have potentially studied a Shakespeare before and they've certainly studied a dramatic text in a previous unit. Likewise, with the pre-1900 poetry, they have come across poetic techniques in their modern anthology and in any work on Unseen. So they can carry some of this knowledge and knowledge of the concepts through, even though they will be looking at these texts within particular movements and within particular socio-historical contexts. So hopefully it should feel that it's not wholly new material as we come to this unit, but it would be interesting as we move through this morning if people would like to share if there is a particular way they come at this or if they have a novel approach to helping the candidates gain that independence and draw on the prior knowledge. And thinking as we go through any potential advantages or drawbacks of models we might use. So for now, we're going to mainly look at questions from Hamlet, purely to think about getting candidates to engage with that sense of critical reading right from the outset. So we're going to look at 3 Hamlet questions taken from 2 recent sittings. And as we look at the 3 questions, we're going to think about, just in terms of advice to students, which one would you have possibly steered them towards or felt that they would have been able to work with confidence? And we're going to think particularly about this idea of beginning a response. And not necessarily the idea of a hook, which I don't always find helpful, but the sense of a critical engagement with the key statement right from the outset and how that can actually help the student shape an argument. And when we get to the end of the 3, we'll invite people to put some comments in the chat box. And it might be interesting, again, to compare your thoughts with other delegates on this one. So we're looking at question 6 from June 2024. And the question has the similar format throughout the sittings. So what you will get is you will get the prompt or the steer indicated with the inverted commas. Then you will get the core task, the in light of this statement prompt. And then the candidate will get a reminder that they should be talking about contextual factors throughout their answer. So if we take this one first, it speaks of performances and interpretations of Gertrude's character in Hamlet tend to be overly negative. And the statement is there to encourage a critical engagement, and the candidate does not always have to wholly agree with the statement. They can interrogate it, they can challenge it to whatever extent they feel they can support their view, and it's helping them answer the main question, the main function, which is, in light of the statement, explore the ways in which Shakespeare presents the character of Gertrude. And again, that word present is very important. It's reminding them that they must be thinking about stagecraft. They must be thinking about language, certainly, but other aspects of the presentation of Gertrude that may influence an audience response. If they have the information and the source to draw upon, talking of performances and interpretations, that can only serve to enhance the answer and provide a more nuanced response. At the most basic level of engagement, we would expect candidates to engage with the steer as an example of critical interpretation. So that point we said as to what extent would they agree or disagree with the statement, that in itself begins to get them thinking about their own critical position. And as they start the answer, they may want to come out quite strongly whether they sort of think it is a sense of Gertrude is always considered as overly negative, and the sense of what may contribute to that or not, as the case may be. The second option from a January sitting is talking of the whole play. And this time, rather than focusing on a particular character, it's focusing on an element of dramatic technique. And here it's talking about a considerable depth of suspense and tension for the audience to enjoy. And looking at the task, we'd expect candidates to select examples from the play where they feel suspense has been created, to do more than describe that, to try and maybe explain how they feel Shakespeare has built the suspense or built the tension. And then at the very highest level, the candidate may return to the steer and notice this point about enjoyment or entertainment. So that level of nuance where they try and think about in what way is this serving a dramatic function, and in what way is this what audiences expect to see or they anticipate. And that then brings us to those nuanced answers. And then the third example from the 23 paper is about Hamlet's fascination. The core of the fascination lies in the exploration of the unnatural. And the question's asking for an exploration of presentation of unnatural. So certainly candidates would need to possibly identify aspects they think of as unnatural or supernatural. And then as we move through the mark scheme and performance, we look at the steer once more. And we think about bits that could be interrogated further. So the idea of, is it the core of the text? Is this what is central to the text? And this word fascination, a candidate might wish to engage with that and consider what that might mean. It fascinates us in terms of, is it the character's response to the unnatural? Is the use of it itself and its dramatic function within the plot? And that will sort of guide them to various areas. And as just a first moment of feedback, thinking of these questions, we have the core of the fascination in the exploration of the unnatural or the presentation of the unnatural. We have the presentation or the creation of suspension and tension. And we have the sense that Gertrude's character tends to be presented in an overly negative way, or looking more generally at how you feel Shakespeare presents Gertrude. And if we could just think about that briefly, and if you would like to add sort of comments into the chat box, and the question really being either where you might guide your own students, if those were three choices, and possible advice you would give them to get that sense of an opening statement with a key critical position. So if we chose one of those three, and it would be up to you which you chose, what sort of advice could you give your candidate, or where would you steer them in terms of how they could open an argument, either about presentation of the unnatural, creation of suspense or tension, or that idea of the presentation of Gertrude? If we were trying to get them to open with a bold stance, where would they start? And we don't need full sentences. If you want to just type as they come, sort of any comments, any thoughts into the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity then for people to share some ideas. So our chat box, and we can share with everyone, as we said, so we'll all see each other's comments, but hopefully it means we can sort of share some thoughts. And that should be there for you, and it will appear as you type. So taking a moment, and if you phrase it in terms of advice to candidate, how might you advise them to start? We could take the question on screen, or the others were creation of suspense and tension, or the presentation of Gertrude. And if you'd prefer to share your answer verbally, you could enable your mic if you wanted to just talk to us for a moment, or if you're happier to type, we can use chat box. I can certainly leave that one to be pondered, and do feel free to sort of add your comments as you go. So if it does sort of come, and you can think of how to advise them to start. But in terms of more general advice, we can give those students the idea of the plan. We always talk about planning, but it can be very critical in these critical interpretation questions. So we're thinking about how we would set out a brief plan. And in fact, what we'll look at today is how we can actually use the mark scheme to do so. So when we look at the mark scheme, we have two elements to a mark scheme. We have the general performance indicators, which indicate levels of performance. And those are certainly our go-to because they help us see at what level the candidate is operating. But we can also use the indicative content with candidates. So we can go back to questions where there are suggested examples that may appear in an answer. They're not exhausted, by the way. Candidates can come up with other approaches, but it could be a useful revision aid for students. So if we use a past mark scheme with them, we can ask them, are there ways they would improve or add to a list? It can be a sensible starting point for a candidate who's maybe struggling to articulate their ideas about a particular question. We can encourage candidates to peer review plans that they've made after editing the indicative content list. And they might choose, for example, to use the indicative content list and add further quotations or textual references from the text. So they can use the mark scheme as a form of assessment for learning, as a form of planning. So if we took a question from the June 24 paper, if we take the one that we haven't looked at so far, a question about imagery and symbolism. So the steer was that the imagery and symbolism of Hamlet are the most interesting elements. And looking at indicative content on that particular mark scheme and asking candidates to add some examples from the text or from their reading, they could begin by looking at how the imagery and symbolism form an important aspect of setting. And again, we've got this question here about calling to audience or the idea of the engagement or position. We have the sense, obviously, then of characterization. So you may look at something related to Hamlet himself. You might look at the thematic elements of the symbols. So the idea of the toy and something being a great amiss. You might look at contextual factors relating to Elizabethan staging and how certain aspects, particularly sort of supernatural or the appearance of the ghost. You might look at the idea of the imagery of theatre being a core part of the text itself. So it's almost meta theatre. We have Hamlet himself making use of theatre and theatrics and seeming to convey his plan and to work his way through various processes. And we have then the sense of the overall effectiveness of it. So if we're thinking it's the most interesting element, the candidate may choose to accept that or to challenge that. So thinking about how that plan could be improved, one thing that may appear to be missing is the coverage of AO3. And we're thinking about how do we address those contexts in our plans, in our responses. Language points could be conflated. So we could take points about setting and characterization and place them together underneath elements to do with crafting. And that may leave some room for considering context in further depth. It could be the idea of looking at context in relation to a language example. So if the language has a deeper meaning that's informed by context, the candidate could explain it further and evaluate the effectiveness of that choice of image. We are going to look later at AO5 response requirements, and there is a sense that we do look for precision. And we do try and steer candidates away from name checking. So we do try and say, don't just say a Marxist critic might say. We're not sort of just asserting what a certain critic would say, although, as it says here, better than no critical comment at all. But in a perfect world, the candidate will reference some secondary source or another approach or another interpretation. And as we'd said with the question itself, they may choose to support it or they may choose to challenge it. And it shows that they are engaging with a context and a critical interpretation and thinking about its relevance in answering the question. So looking once again at the question on, this time, minor characters. So a question on minor characters, and obviously this is Hamlet, but this could probably work for most of the set texts. We're thinking that minor characters get in the way of a play's central concern, adding nothing worthwhile. And we can see here a deliberate attempt to engage the students critically and to ask them to challenge or to think about the statement. And it's the idea of how is Shakespeare presenting his minor characters? And the question that's not there but implied is also why, for what purpose? And if we're thinking of minor characters and we're thinking of diction, imagery and symbolism, dramatic techniques, context, critical response, effectiveness of use, these steers, these bullets, essentially begin to form the start of a skeleton plan. They begin to help the candidate shape their response. They could begin by choosing their characters, but also making sort of a statement as to whether they feel their characters or characterization supports or challenges the steer. And then they could begin to look at those aspects of crafting. So notice that diction and language, it's forming one part of a larger answer. So we do have other focuses on language with our imagery and symbolism, but we're thinking about them maybe in terms of their dramatic contexts and how they are read by an audience in a performance. And looking at yet another example, we're thinking about the stems and how the stems can work. And the point is that the quote or the prompt is there to guide them to either send them in a certain critical direction or invite them to challenge a certain critical standpoint. But they must remember that the stem, the second part, is the key of the question, the explore the ways element. So we have, explore the ways in which Shakespeare presents self-interest. And we can see immediately that a candidate will probably have to define what they believe self-interest to mean. What is self-interest and how is it portrayed or displayed in these particular characters? And then looking at the secondary prompt, the prompt at the start, we have this idea of an evaluation when it says an outstanding insight of the power of self-interest. And once again, the candidate doesn't necessarily need to agree, but they need to sort of unpick that and think about, if they've defined what they think self-interest is, how can they see its power and what do we mean by its power? And do we feel that the play is offering us that insight, as it says? So you might look there, for example, at soliloquy at a certain point and how it works as a dramatic function. And we're thinking, as we said, of ways. So we're always trying to think of stagecraft. And thinking about the task, it's the second part in depth informed by the first. So the second bullet is the task, and the first part, the prompt, is there to inform their critical reading and to help them challenge. So we're trying to encourage them to argue. So we are saying, do not feel that you have to agree with that prompt. We are noticing in recent years that candidates' reference to stage versions have become a strength, and that's really pleasing to see. And do note that this also means the film and television adaptations. We cannot all get to live performance, but it's thinking about the adaptation as a potential interpretation or as a potential context. It can be used in two ways. And it's the relevance. So that is a key point. We don't just want a description of a performance scene. We really want candidates to hone in on very precise examples that may illuminate their point or support their argument. So if, for example, they do decide that an element of costuming is relevant, they would have to try and bring that into their answer, say, for example, on a particular character and how they're interpreted, or on a particular theme and how it may be interpreted. So thinking about how this could be done effectively, looking at that tricky question, so to speak, the fascination in the exploration of the unnatural, this candidate has sort of managed it quite well. So this is a section of their response. So another aspect of Hamlet's character that the play's critics have spotlighted as being quite unnatural, the nature of his feelings about his mother. T.S. Eliot argued that Hamlet is dominated by an emotion which is inexpressible because it's in excess of the facts as they appear, suggesting that the depth of Hamlet's rage about his mother's infidelity, noting that it hath made me mad, is almost unnatural to the point of being inexplicable. So there is quite a lot going on in that sort of quite long, complex sentence. And if we break it down on what the candidate is doing well, they're certainly aware of critical reading and they name check T.S. Eliot. And the key point is they do not just place a quotation and describe it. They engage with it in suggesting an interpretation of the Eliot, suggesting the depth of his rage is about the infidelity. And then they back that up in a cogent argument with a textual reference, noting that it hath made me mad. And then finally, to make their argument cohesive, they've drawn it together and felt that in response to the key terms of the question, it's almost unnatural to the point of being inexplicable. So this candidate is handling the material very well. They're dealing with an aspect of character, they're bringing in critical reference, they're supporting it with textual example, and they're remembering to bring it back to the key terms of their question, therefore keeping it relevant to the task set. And they go further, they develop their evaluation. Indeed, Hamlet's graphic fascination on his mother's lust, to the point where he visualizes her and Claudius honeying and making love on the nasty sty, and the planting of wretchy kisses on her cheek, has prompted Freudian critics like Ernest Jones to argue he can't bring himself to kill Claudius because he did a deed he wanted to do, and that Hamlet is both fascinated and disgusted as a result. Now here we have a second interpretation and another approach. And once again, you can see the candidate is quite confident in integrating references and bringing textual references together with the readings that they've done. They move on to look at performance. Many interpretations of the play, like Laurence Olivier's 1948 version, stress the incestuous undertones of Hamlet's and his mother's relationship. And it's certainly true that the vivid imagery and his rage at his mother produces does make it somewhat unnatural in its excessiveness. And this makes the play all the more intriguing. So the candidate manages their materials well. They move quite fluidly between critical sources and the text itself, and they keep an eye on the question at all times. So this is someone who is sort of moving through and making that nuanced argument that we're hoping to find. But one thing we do need to stress with diction and language choice is that, yes, it is key and it certainly can support an answer, but it has been an observation that the lower band answers often focus on this to the detriment of everything else. So there can be quite a lot of word level analysis, suggesting the candidate has maybe zoned in on extracts in the past and knows certain things to say about very short sections, but they're not able to sort of put it together in a holistic argument. They've got to engage with other content and be sure that they're not just looking at the technical feature of the play, but extending it into evaluation and response. So not just what it's there, but why is it there and to what effect. They can sometimes try to make use of terms and not fully understanding. And again, that can sometimes obfuscate the argument. So everything that's used, we say, is it relevant? We've talked about openings and how important they are, but it's worth talking to your candidate about their conclusion. Quite often, where a conclusion has been included, a candidate will often repeat the terms and even the language that they've used in their introduction. And we do appreciate it can be because of timing problems, but we are trying to get candidates to think of a conclusion moment. So they are sort of returning to their key argument, they are restating their critical position, but they need to sort of do that whilst bringing sort of a fresh evaluation in. Having considered the evidence throughout their essay, they have, as we said, the so-called killer closing line. It can be helpful just to remind themselves of the terms of the question, although it does warn us that the idea of just rehashing or repeating the question, X and Y, is not fully recommended. It's not taking the argument further. If they've presented a reasonable response, we do enjoy that idea of that final opinion about what they've studied. And that being said, obviously, we said it has to be critical as opposed to purely personal. We will be doing an extended marking activity. It's going to be based on the June 2024 paper. And we're going to be looking at script A, which is going to be a question on the taming of the shrew. And the prompt that the candidates had received was the main appeal of the taming of the shrew lies in the contrast between appearance and reality. And we're going to just have a look at that one. So if you can find your own script in your own pack, it is, if you've not sort of got your delegate pack handy, it is also in the Zoom. If you go to more and resources, you should be able to download it if you've not got a copy already. And the response, as we said, is to the paper, and it's the question about illusion and reality, appearance and reality. So the question is, explore the ways in which Shakespeare presents appearance and reality in the taming of the shrew. And it says, in your answer, please consider relevant contextual factors. So this is our response. I will give you some silent reading time. You will need the full response, so it's probably best if you do download in your own Zoom room. And we'll sort of come back and we'll look at what the script achieved. And today we will sort of go through it in a little bit more detail so we can spot and identify these aspects that have been mentioned so far: the clear positioning of an argument, the use of context, the use of critical interpretations. So if you just want to take 5 minutes now to read your copy, and then into chat box, because we've not had sort of contributions yet, but if we can sort of overcome the shyness, and if we can just have a suggested level and not necessarily a full commentary, but just 1 or 2 comments why you feel it would achieve that level. And as I said, we'll have some feedback in 5 minutes time at 9:40 on the screen clock. If you do have a problem locating the resources, if you can just pop a message into the chat box, and I think Hansel may be able to give you a link to direct you to it. Sorry, Philson, it's script A. So the document is called script A. No problem. And if we're having a problem locating it, it should be in the resources section. And Hansel may be able to give you a link if you're still unable to get access to that. And I'll just give people a few more moments to read through. And then if you can place your comments, suggested level, and possibly features to support that level into the chat box. So are we thinking level 3, clear and relevant? Level 4, discriminating and controlled? Level 5, critical and evaluative? Yes, so Philson started us with a high band 4, feeling it's controlled, it's discriminating. Any further comments? Any further takers? If we can have maybe a few comments so we can get a range of responses, and then we'll go through the mark it received and sort of the reasons why. So is there a strong agreement on level 4? Anyone think it goes a little higher? Anyone think it moves over into 5? Or anyone feel it's going a little lower and clear and relevant? So we just wait for a few more responses and then we can share the mark. Thank you, Wilson, for your response. Just maybe a few more comments as well. Any other comments? Get a range of ideas. Thank you, Victor. So you're feeling it does enough for 5. We've got some sustained work. We've got some evaluation. We've got some sophisticated structure and expression. So we've got 4 and 5. And Vincent, you've said now you might push it into 5, but not quite full marks. And that's going to be sort of quite interesting in a moment when we look at what it gets. So in terms of, we're saying, definitely we're feeling, is there an agreement? We're feeling, we're confident that it certainly has a degree of discrimination in it, and it's got a degree of control of response, that it certainly gets a 4. And then Philson, as you said, you've done the agreement there of the 5, thinking actually, does it go into the 5? And indeed, yes, it does. So we're saying a low 5, high 4. Hopefully we've got agreement with other people here as well. That's certainly where we are looking at. This candidate, we felt, has done everything we would want for a 4. And then, as you've thought, and that's why I particularly like, Philson, when you wrote the second comment, you thought, actually, I'm thinking it might push to a 5. And you're pretty shrewd when you said it's certainly not looking at top marks, but it does enough to get into a 5, and it does achieve the mark of 21. So if we think about what it does and why we think it does make it to 5, and it does qualify as a 5 for critical and evaluative. If we look at this opening paragraph, the candidate has taken the question about illusion and reality, and they've stayed quite sharply focused on it. And while we said that we don't always want sort of a name check of a critical context or a critical interpretation, this is a candidate who's very aware that that's something we do in this question, aren't they? So they've set a little bit of historical context by noting the timing. They've talked then about it potentially being a farce. So we have a genre there, as well as mentioning Bloom, and the sense of a very succinct mention of why this may be a farce with the intertwined plot lines, and the sense of contrast and appearance and reality. So the candidate is engaging with the key terms of the question. They're showing us that they're able to introduce both context and aspects of interpretation, and then they present their own view at this point. As we say, we're maybe not saying absolute tip top 5 if we're thinking maybe they're being a bit tentative. You know, they do bring in a potential technique. They talk about deceit through disguise, and they reference it as a common aspect of a Shakespearean comedy. So maybe possibly a little tentative to start, but they certainly know what it is we're asking them to do. They know that they're being asked to integrate these ideas. They know that they're being asked to sort of produce a form of a standpoint. And as they move in, they've decided to hone in on or focus on some male characters. And we have, again, possibly we'd say that the student maybe leads with their secondary sources, but there is a sense that they are engaging with the play throughout. They are trying to constantly reference those AO3, AO5 points that some candidates actually find quite tricky. There is some textual reference. They talk about the soliloquy and introduce the context of it within the narrative of the story. And then there is some mention of the imagery of the falcon, perhaps a little general when they say it's something that was quite common at the time. But what we're saying here is we are aware of time constraints. We are aware of what we're asking the candidate to do. And they're constantly pushing, they're constantly choosing examples, and they're constantly trying to weave them together with context and weave them together with what they recall from their critical interpretation. They're using a range of critics, so we have sort of more than one viewpoint presented. And they do move through, actually, as we go through the work, they move through a range of techniques. So they've talked briefly about the soliloquy and the imagery of the falcon. They then comment on tone. We might think occasionally there's a little bit of a colloquial slip, for example, when they say patronizing her, but they bring in points about costume. They look at farce again, so something that they did mention in the introduction. They return to this idea of farce as a genre, and they show an understanding of that. And in fact, they can take several examples for that. So that, again, is one of the elements that's kind of pushing towards that 5. They mention the illusion, and again, not just mentioning it, but then looking at what exactly is it doing, the idea of it crossing a boundary. And once more, then we're bringing back the words of illusion and reality. So they're bringing back in the key terms of the question. There's certainly a shaping of the response. There's certainly an awareness of, as we said, the performance and assessment objectives. And there is this sense that there's an attempt to craft an argument about the men first and then the women. And then we look at possibly Katerina, she develops through the play. And we could argue that we'd like a longer conclusion, but we are aware that it is under time circumstances. And we're looking for what is there as opposed to what's not there. So although I did say earlier we would like a nice, sharp, killer conclusion, we maybe don't get that on this answer, but that would be one of the reasons why. We're not saying it's a secure 5. We're saying it's certainly a secure level 4 with flashes of critical and evaluative work, and enough that we feel a best fit would award this student just into that level 5, so at that sort of lower end of it. And that's what we sort of mean by best fit. I think we'd mostly agree here that we thought it certainly had level 4 characteristics, and it just had these moments. And I think the moments combined with the idea of the control and the awareness of task, it's enough to take that student through and to sort of give them that mark and feel that it's a mark that they've deserved. And then just looking at how it reads from the table, from the performance indicators, we do have evidence of this. And as we said, it's maybe not sustained, it's maybe not consistent, but we can find some evidence for each of these bullets somewhere in the answer. And as we said, there's aspects we'd probably want to improve. We might want that conclusion developed a little bit further, but there are some impressive elements here. And this is definitely a strong response. So this is definitely what we're encouraging candidates to do. And that's just what we need to sort of get across to our candidates as well. We are looking for them, catching them being good, so to speak. We're looking for what they're doing well. We're looking for them enjoying their text and making those critical discoveries and making those critical challenges. And where there may be aspects that as teachers and as people who know the text well, we think, I wish you'd done a little bit more of that. We are very much aware that it is a timed activity and that they are sort of working with a range of AOs. And at this point, and I see that someone has just been readmitted into the room, I was just about to say that at this halfway stage, we would suggest now to give you a short well-being break if you want to sort of go for a quick refreshment. I know some people are moving in and out of lessons and they're very busy. And what I will suggest is we will start the second part of the session at 10 o'clock on this clock. So it gives you just slightly under 10. It gives you 9 minutes just to go and sort of get a quick refresh and tea or a coffee. And we'll meet back again for the second part of the section and looking at the section B of paper 4. So I do just apologise. I realise someone did just join us. What you can do if you have just joined, you could try the activity that we've just completed, which is reading script A and working out a level, and then putting the level in the chat box just with some comments as to why you think it's that level. But certainly thank you, those of you who did contribute comments, and you were pretty much laser focused on exactly where that essay was placed in the mark scheme, just at that borderline, just enough, as we said, for that mark. So I will see you again at 10 o'clock UK time. So that's now 8 minutes. I'll see you all soon. And thank you. Oh, hi, Monique. Did that clear that one up for the adaptations? Oh, great, thanks. Okay, hopefully everyone's had a quick chance for a quick refresh. Just very quickly, Monique did ask a question about adaptations. And certainly the candidate in script A didn't maybe necessarily look to adaptations, although they did look at some critical interpretations, which would also cover for the AO5. But the paragraph that we had on the slide where the student mentioned Olivier, that would be the kind of brief adaptation reference that we might be looking at. And I think there are some examples as well. If you've been in the Unit 2 meeting, I think a candidate there did some very good work with sort of referencing adaptations as well. So if you have got that pack, you can look back to that one too. So that brings us then on to section B. And I do thank everyone, by the way, for bearing with us. I know it's a bit of a whistle stop tour, and I know also that we're all very busy. Um, it's not necessary, actually, just picking up actually on your point, Monique, it wouldn't be necessary that they have to do absolutely everything. So you could still get a level 5 without referencing performance, but certainly what this candidate did have in lieu of performance, they really had quite a wide range of reference to critical and secondary sources. It's kind of horses for courses, really, with certain questions. There will be questions where they would invite use of an adaptation in a critical way, and there may be questions that perhaps the candidates will find that they're engaging with academic sources a little bit more. It's kind of a we sort of mark what's there again if we keep using that point. So we wouldn't sort of certainly deduct marks for it being missing. It's not sort of a prerequisite. It would just be one way of achieving AO5. Okay, so moving to our pre 1900 poetry. And as I said, once again, thank you for coping with quite a lot of information in a short period of time. And we are looking at, again, our similar assessment objectives, and we're thinking about our articulation of arguments, looking at how meanings are shaped, thinking about the context where relevant, and thinking about those interpretations and how they inform us. And as we said, these lists now, they will look similar to lists that you've seen for your earlier units and for the unseen. We're thinking about formal aspects and structure, choice of language, although we're trying not to just let that be our leading focus, possible significance of imagery, symbols, and motifs, rhyme and rhythm where relevant. So once again, we make sure that we try and maintain a focus on relevance to a question or relevance to an argument, and then theme, tone, mood, and voice. So we do want to say that candidates can discuss the function of poetic features, although, as we said, we want to avoid that idea of the feature spotting. So it's getting that balance right, isn't it? It's them showing that they do know this is a particular form, a particular genre, and thinking also not just about what is there and how it's constructed, but also the way that we might possibly read these texts and sort of think about them in critical and creative ways. We're going to be looking in this question at the expression of attitudes and values, and that will come out not maybe just from the poets themselves and the individual purpose, but that may be a discussion of those wider contexts and how they inform reading. And we might then look as well at the using that academic language and academic register to discuss the poems. Looking then at our three options, we often have a number of answers on the romantic poets. Metaphysicals are also popular. We don't see maybe as many Victorians as we used to, but we have representation of all three across entries. So looking at the typical questions, and we can see that, as with the Shakespeare, we are following a similar format each time. So the candidate will be redirected to a particular set poem. They will be asked to consider occasionally a theme and maybe at other times a potential technique or a wider idea. And it will be in the named poem and one other poem from the prescribed list. And certainly, I think candidates now, we don't very often see them not using the prescribed list, but it is just something to remind them of before they go into their test, that their second poem, the free choice poem, it must still be from the set list. We do occasionally still have students who will just sort of choose one that they feel works well, but it has to be one that they have studied and that is on the list. So looking at Ode on a Grecian Urn, we can see the question, hopefully, is quite accessible to the student. It's looking at the sense of how timelessness is created and thinking as well as not just maybe describing those moments, but how it's achieved, not just through language and imagery, but perhaps through format and structure. And once again, with the Shelley, we're looking at the poem The Question, and then we're thinking of power of the imagination. And we can see, hopefully, with these questions that they are inviting candidates to engage with context and should hopefully give them confidence to engage with those romantic contexts. Looking at personal response, the wordings of the tasks will not change apart from the core target. So the beginning will begin, explore the ways, and the bit that changes will be, in this case, timelessness is created. So we've got the sense that it's always an exploration. It does not have to be line by line, and in fact, we would sort of discourage potentially that chronological approach because it sometimes can become too focused on word level. But we're thinking about context and meaningful connections they may make with the poem that they've chosen. So they're thinking that actually the poem that they've chosen will hopefully help them enhance their ideas and present a level of nuance. So thinking about the question and approaches, if they were picking timelessness and Ode to a Grecian Urn, what other poem might sort of be a hopeful, effective pairing? And once again, it's hard maybe to do it today of putting everyone on the spot, but the idea, if you're doing this with your candidates, you might ask them to do an activity where they consider an opening and a closing line first. So the idea of presenting that argument, presenting that critical stance, and then finding the information and support to back it up. Always remember that they must focus on ways. So occasionally what we get, particularly if a candidate selects a poem, which they maybe find challenging, is just taking care it's not slipping into description. So we're sort of always focusing on ways in which this particular idea is being presented. And the sense of how could they use a plan. A point we make on plans, there is no particular method we'd recommend. We do realise candidates are familiar with some planning mnemonics from GCSE, and while we don't discourage them, we find that sometimes candidates who stick to those quite mechanically maybe do not get to make as effective an argument in sort of AS A-level responses. So while those might be fine earlier in the course for a candidate to sort of build confidence and build an awareness that they're definitely answering the question or providing sufficient examples, by this stage, we'd hope that they would form a shape to a response, which is, as we saw with the section A, a little bit more cogent and cohesive and balancing out comments on the poem with maybe comments on the wider context. There is no right answer for which is a perfect poem. And in fact, sometimes candidates can really surprise us by choosing a poem that we maybe think is a more unusual choice. And they do a very effective consideration of how both illuminate a particular theme. The point is that do make sure they don't move off the list because it would be seen as a rubric infringement and it does actually create a huge penalty in terms of marks and capping of levels. So do just tell them it is quite important to stick with the list, but we don't sort of over worry about that one. So with an opening and closing line, we want to avoid just stating the question. So I have been asked to write, but we're thinking about the how. So we could look for how they refer back to the question throughout the task, maybe with a slight change of words or slight change of focus, and trying to move them beyond just word level to look at form and structure. So things that we might ask candidates to avoid. Although they do tend to take this approach in unseen, we really do ask them to avoid a linear model. If they work their way through in a chronological order, it may be less likely that a response will seem sophisticated. Whereas if they engage with aspects of the question and they think about how different elements of the poem may illuminate that, or different elements of formal structure may illuminate that, that will be much more nuanced than just working through in that sort of methodical fashion. Thinking about also how some of these things work together or work separately. So if a candidate is struggling with the cohesive approach, it may be a better idea to suggest to them that they deal with the aspects in separate sections. So again, you will know your candidates and you will know their performance and where they're aiming. For some candidates, it may make more sense that they deal with key aspects in separate sections. For some candidates, they may be quite capable of interweaving those points within larger parts of their own critical response. So looking at the romanticism, which, as we said, is usually the most common choice. We've got the question on The Question by Shelley, and it's about power of the imagination. So we can see there's a real invite for working through some key contextual factors. And it's worth thinking about that phrase. We sort of take it for granted, perhaps, and we think, oh, yes, this is our key romantic theme. But it is worth getting the student to interrogate those terms and point out what it means to them. So they might think about looking at indicative content if they were doing it retrospectively as a task in class. And we did say this idea is a useful planning tool. So students can look at past papers and use the indicative content and review it and actually sort of challenge it or add extra information or add references and quotations from the chosen poems. Grids can sometimes help students make meaningful connections. So they may be wishing to group some of their poems in terms of themes, techniques, creation of effect. So looking at tackling the question. Quite a few students felt that a good pair would be the Ode to a Nightingale and things that may have come up in the answer. Looking at diction, words that are directly linking to the power of imagination, words like dreamed or visionary, and notice that sometimes the very short, succinct quote can actually make the point in an effective, precise way. Looking at images that do present those visions, so the starry riverbuds, children of the hour. The way the imagination frames the proposal. So the idea that there is sort of a dramatic context as well. So there is this sense that there's a dramatic action happening and how the formal aspects bring that across. The possibility that contextually this poem may have been written as an escape. So the sense that there is actually a sense of loss underpinning. The idea of the romantic imagination. So here we do engage with the term and what we think it means in a romantic context. We could look either at another poet and what they feel, or we could look at some critical sources. And suggestion there, for example, is you might look at poets sort of debating with each other or discussing with each other. So we've got Browning to Shelley there. With AO3, what can we include? Remembering that section B does have that slightly heavier weighting. We do say that obviously the life and situation and place and time of writing are important, but we must insist with candidates that they try to make sure they relate to the text and the question. We're trying to avoid those large chunks where a candidate may tell us, sort of a potted biography. We're looking for elements of the life and where it can be very clearly linked either to a particular image or a particular formal choice, if it's felt to be sort of expressing a state of mind, for example. It can be useful to talk about setting, time, and location, but again, where it is relevant. So it is this idea of relevance. The literary movements are suggested by the names of the anthologies. So, clearly we're sort of directing students that way. So we can look at, although we don't maybe want to make an exhaustive list, but we can look at what we might consider are the romantic characteristics or the metaphysical characteristics of a particular group of poems. It is possible to consider context of reception. And again, if we can keep it relevant, so the sense of a relevance of it to understanding the poem or expanding upon the arguments. There is a lot to work through, and there are various things that candidates can do as sort of independent work beyond the classroom. So they can begin with some more basic introductory elements. So they can look themselves on places like YouTube just to get sort of an easy introduction. And they can make presentations back to one another. Again, thinking about things like they've said, for example, looking at the significance of the Industrial Revolution, not just describing it. And things like quizzes and flashcards are always useful ways of testing active learning. Moving through at scholarly resources, we have sort of a range of areas they can access, some of which will be subscription, some of which will be free. And there is a mention here of the potential misuse of AI, and we will look at that sort of later in the session because it's becoming more and more of an issue. But as we said, try and avoid the biographical chunks. So we mustn't just have the context in there with no regard to the question, with no regard to a particular formal feature. So we're looking for smaller elements, but relevant elements. And it does say, we want to avoid that sort of first 200 words summarizing the life of a poet. If we're wanting a level 5, it's the keywords evaluation and appreciation of significance and influence of the factor. So not only do they know the contextual factor, but they can see actually it's a way of appreciating a certain element of the poem in light of the question, or it may be sort of a significant way of understanding a particular image or a particular idea being proposed. So the thought about AI, we know we don't want it as sort of a tool that candidates are using to skip or cut corners on assessment. But if candidates are using it in independent learning, we may need to sort of teach them to use it responsibly. So thinking about being clear about misuse, they obviously must never use AI to submit something as their own, and that's just sort of clear on it. But how could they use AI in a meaningful way in practice or in independent revision? And if we turn to a metaphysical question from June 2024, the question was on Donne's song, Go and Catch a Falling Star. And it's a reasonable question on mood and tone, which in its broadness may invite danger because we are trying to keep things relevant and focused, and one other poem. So we can see from a question like this that if a candidate simply submitted the words mood and tone, they're going to generate a very broad data set, and they're going to generate information that's really not going to be useful to their study or useful to their independent research. But they may want to do some work around their poems. So say, for example, they'd chosen to look at song and then working with another poet, looking at Sick Rose. You could set them a limit of 750 words. You could ask them to include or find relevant historical, biographical, and social contexts. You could ask them to have a look at Blake in terms of mood and tone, although like looking at Donne, it could be too general a steer and could give them a less useful response. You could ask them to pick some quotations and possibly input those as prompts and then see if there's some information about a particular reference. You could ask them to include some references from reliable sources. And that's the key, because what you're hoping is to remove candidates' dependency on AI. You're hoping that they recognize that AI very often generates incorrect sources and, in fact, completely fabricated sources. So you want them to sort of be able to read with a critical mind. You want them to recognize that ChatGPT in particular makes up critical quotes. And makes them look quite believable with quite believable bibliographic references, but they must be aware that some of these quotes are completely generated and are not sort of from an actual source. But they could use it to think about prose style and actually get them to edit and critique these responses that they get using AI tools. And you'll find quite quickly that they will recognize the need for the human touch. They will recognize the need for a nuanced argument. They will recognize the need for a useful and different conclusion. So it's using the AI as a teaching moment, and hopefully then it will teach them to be more cautious in any use that they may be doing outside the classroom. With the poetry, particularly pre-1900, This one for AO5, we tend to perhaps find that the criteria for this is slightly less developed than in section A, although we have sort of seen improvements in recent series. We can respond to critical comments on a basic level, and we've said this before about other questions. Sometimes even the candidate taking a stance against the question is an AO5 response in itself, but that's not obviously going to get you very far up the mark scheme. Beyond this, trying to reference a specific critic can be good, and therefore if it's relevant to the class and to the text. So ways that they can bring it in. They can bring in a particular critic, a particular reading. They can bring in various fields, and maybe fields that shed new light on a text. Eco-criticism, for example, may shed a new way of looking at a particular romantic text, for example. We want them to interpret what they include. So not just a critic says, but we want them to actually think about, has this illuminated a reading? Is this relevant to help answer the question? And then as we look through, we will have another response, which is going to be in the pack, which is going to be section B. And what we will do this time is we will read it through together, and then we will leave everyone some time to consider. This time I will say sort of consider maybe a particular mark, particular level, and we'll think about why the level is chosen. So I'll just bring up script B. And this was the question on Ode to a Grecian Urn. So we're looking at Ode to a Grecian Urn, and it's the question on timelessness. And it's typed, and as we said, you can try and locate it. We'll read it through together this time. So among the most quintessential ideas that inspired Romantic poetry is the idea it could serve as a vehicle for renewal. More specifically, that the contemplation contained, undertaken in a stimulating environment, preferably a natural one, is capable of yielding such insight to reinvigorate and re-inspire human beings in a world of despair. So just something to note, the candidate started with a fairly confident tone, and they have a viewpoint about the poetry, although perhaps we're maybe not getting timelessness yet. The above lines might be considered a summary not only of Wordsworth's lines written in early spring, but Keats' sonnet on the sea. Both poems embodied a broadly similar approach to ideas of renewal, located in terms of power of the renewal that nature can confer. In both, the poets approach a natural setting, wearied by the miseries of the human condition. So I think actually with this one as well, if we just take a quick look, I think it should actually be the other question. So that one has been put there, but it is sort of the question on Keats and Wordsworth. The premise on which arguably begin is that the weariness of poets begin an exploration with the excesses of society. In Wordsworth's poem, he asks, "Have I not reason to lament what man has made of man?" In Keats's poem, he addresses those whose ears have dinned with uproar rude, and whose eyeballs are vexed and tired, in asking them to immerse themselves in the wideness of the sea. In both, the idea is conveyed that the two poems arrive at the present state seeking renewal because of the misery urban society evokes in them. And this articulates a concern universal to all of the Romantics, a disenchantment with the human condition, variously leading to them either seeking solitude to contemplate or actively engaging with and challenging it. It must be noted that Keats took Wordsworth as a role model in composing the early poetry. As such, it might be argued that any resemblances between the two poems are possibly a conscious imitation, the latter style by the former. Both poems then go on to present a key source of renewal as a power of nature to inspire contemplation. In Wordsworth's poem, he clearly establishes himself as having in a grove sate reclined, noting that nature is capable of putting one into a sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to mind, suggesting it carries the power to inspire and provoke reflection necessary to induce a renewal. In Keats's poem, despite a less personal tone, Keats preferring to use direct address as opposed to lyrical or confessional manner, his exhortation to sit ye in an old cavern's mouth and brood arguably strikes exactly the same pursuit as Wordsworth. Namely, the idea renewal can be achieved by taking a place of solitude in the midst of natural beauty and allowing one to brood and process sad thoughts in tranquility. This might be perhaps explained with reference to Wordsworth's idea of poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility, and certainly explains the retrospective tone his use of the past tense in words like heard and sate creates. And just note that we have come back to the word level there, but we've actually worked at that higher level and we've looked at some techniques and direct address. In both poems, the use of the senses to take in nature's details is arguably similarly presented as crucial to this. Wordsworth, for instance, evokes sensory image through noting he's having heard 1,000 blended notes, evoking the sensation of breezy air and describing in intricate detail the visual sight of birds around me that hopped and played. In a similar manner, Keats also appeals to multiple senses, in evoking not only the visual wideness of the sea, but the eternal whisperings that one hears when situated next to it. The creation of descriptive imagery, from Wordsworth's intricate evocation of the scene in the third stanza of The Periwinkle Trailed its Wreath, through the green bower to Keats's juxtaposition of the mighty swell and the very smallest shell, rhyme adding emphasis to the scale and grandeur, is arguably presented in both poems as crucial to the experience of renewal. Again, this might be explained with reference to Wordsworth's emphasis on the importance of visual faculties for recollection of emotion, his poetry emphasizing the way in which the speaker imprints the beauty of surroundings in their and the reader's mind, in order to digest and extract pleasure and renewal from them. And this is arguably echoed exactly in Keats's poem, how both the narrators themselves are largely supine, the majority of the poem focusing simply on taking in features and beauty of the natural scene surrounding the narrators, rather than feelings of narrators themselves. The two poems are further similar in how they present the sublimity of nature as a key property, conducive to renewing effort exerts on them. In Wordsworth's poem, it's articulated through the way he presents all of nature linked in harmonious existence, noting conviction that every flower enjoys the air it breathes, and the least motion which birds carried a thrill of pleasure, even extending to the periwinkle with the use of the verb trailed, evoking ideas of languorous serenity. In a personification of nature, capital letter highlighting it, Wordsworth arguably presents himself as drawing comfort from a sense of order and higher consciousness he perceives in nature surrounding him, from the personification of how the flowers enjoy air to the way the periwinkle consciously trailed wreaths, and how budding twigs attempted to catch breezy air, noting that this belief might be from heaven sent, and pleasure is nature's holy plan. Wordsworth arguably presents himself as drawing renewal from the transcendence of natural beauty inspires in him, and the ability to immerse himself in higher truths of pleasure and bliss that order and organization convey. Total surrender allowing nature to link a human soul through Miran in a sense of joy. In this manner, Wordsworth almost articulates a Kantian spiritual, pantheistic, and Spinoza-esque idea of sublime, and represents a conscious power reminding of the oneness of creation. Keats arguably articulates similar ideas about the power to renew and the solemnity of nature, but in a much less philosophical and more purely descriptive manner. Like Wordsworth's deification of nature, Keats arguably devotes attention to the ancient power of the sea to keep eternal whisperings round, with reference to Hecate and old caverns creating a sense of it as timeless and transcendent force, also capitalizing in exactly the same way as Wordsworth does nature, the effect of indicating its beauty stemming from a perception of a higher consciousness. However, whilst Wordsworth adheres to a softer version of the sublime, presenting it arising from the harmonious unity in various natural phenomena, Keats arguably focuses on a more Burkean concept of sublime, emphasizing the raw power of the sea's mighty swell to glut 10,000 caverns, a use of plosive alliteration and hyperbole combining to further add the tone of raw power. In speaking of winds of heaven being unbound, Keats again creates an idea of the sea as harsh and nature as possessed of tremendous power emanating directly from heaven that has to be bound to prevent it exerting full force. Indeed, worth pointing a small similarity in the poem's use of hyperbole exists on how both use the word thousand to show power and multiplicity of nature. However, while Wordsworth arguably renews himself through belief in nature's divinity and unity that sublime aspires, Keats's renewal is presented as far less spiritual, simply stemming from awe at duality and unpredictability of the sea, the capacity for the mighty swell and wideness to glut 10,000 caverns, yet assume a gentle temper that scarcely will the smallest shell be moved. It perhaps shows a key difference in the worldview of the poets. While Wordsworth was much more religious, in other poems calling himself a worshipper of nature, perhaps explaining the more spiritual bent of his poem, and trying to find nature's holy pain, Keats was more agnostic and did not seek to read as much metaphysics in nature he described. If anything, Keats derived comfort from the unpredictability of nature rather than harmony and order, as exemplified in the poem by exaltation of duality of the sea. This reflects his own focus on the idea of negative capability and the idea that unpredictability was not only inevitable, but also meant beauty, truth, and truth, beauty. And the unconditional surrender to nature is the only way to achieve any kind of transcendence or renewal. not through understanding, but simply through allowing oneself to feel beauty without seeking to understand truth. And we can see clearly this student is typing, so they possibly had some additional time because we're still going. Another subtle difference worth paying attention to between the poems is an undertone of doubt that seems to underpin Wordsworth's tone in a way that it does not in Keats. For instance, words like my faith, belief seemed more affirmative vocabulary like is and does all seem to convey the idea that Wordsworth is somewhat uncertain about the truth of his philosophical derivations from nature, and it somehow undermines a renewing effect the natural scene exerts on him. He, however, notes, I must think, do all I can, and have a pleasure there, and notes it seems a thrill of pleasure. It might be argued Wordsworth is admitting his view of nature is simply a projection, that in actual fact the world is colder and survival obsessed than he'd like to believe. While Keats arguably avoids the doubt and celebrating the wind morality of nature, letting it aid his self-renewal, Wordsworth runs to it, and perhaps because he takes renewal from conviction that nature shows goodness and pleasure to be a true state of man's condition, a conviction that gives him reason to lament what man has made of man, because he knows it's unnatural. This dilemma is arguably characteristics of Wordsworth's romantic approach, mixing doubt and his own sad thought with the positive beauty of nature, mirroring duality and contradiction of the world where romantics lived in. In Keats's work, the idea of negative capability is an expression of this. Both poems also bear similarities in the way the two poets make use of structural and oral devices. On one hand, Keats's is a Petrarchan sonnet, with 8 lines focused on descriptive imagery, leading to a volta shift, 6 mainly focused on Keats' exhortations to the reader. On the other, Wordsworth also displays rigid form, with 6 quatrains in iambic tetrameter exhibiting A-B rhyme scheme. In Wordsworth's poem, it's arguably evocative of the order he sees or wishes to project on the nature surrounding him, presenting the experience as perfect in the power to renew. In Keats, the use of a classical form again links the sea to an ancient power, while using the initial ABA rhyme scheme invokes motion of the tide, and the later rhyme scheme CEDCC of the final lines evoking poetry of Milton and leading a further epic air. Just as Keats's poem uses alliteration for effect, so does Wordsworth. In the alliterative phase, man is made of man, conveying the depth of his indignation. As such, what emerges overall from the comparison is the idea they both bear striking similarities in myriad ways. Both represent typical articulations of M.H. Auden's view that romantic poetry is distinguished by the use of nature as a lamp to illuminate critical reflection that leads to renewal. In Keats's words, to act as a muse, as if sea nymphs squired, and spur renewed creative energy and faith in humanity. Both present renewal as necessary due to the misery of human condition. Both present it as occurring via immersion in nature, with both presenting it occurring specifically because of the sublimity of nature, even if they derive different meaning from this, reflecting the different worldviews. Thus, in similarity and difference, the two make for illuminating comparison. So the question there was actually about renewal and how it illuminates. And in terms of what the candidate does and doesn't do, before we go as far as suggesting possibly a mark as well as a level, any comments on things you feel are strengths? Any comments on things you would feel you'd like to see more of? And again, if you need to look through again, it's script B. Obviously, it's a long one. It's a typed script. I think what they've done is they put the wrong 11 there. So if you want to go through that again for a few moments yourself. And if at minute 35, if you want to note any comments, if you want to sort of come straight and think what mark it achieved. Just try and bring the question up for you as well. Stop share for a moment. Let's just take a couple of moments to read that one through. If you'd like to hazard a mark and possibly a comment as to why you think it may have achieved that mark. Just a moment or two more. Failing that, what you feel are either strengths or potentially something you'd like to see more of. And if you're a little unsure, what level do you feel that answer may have achieved? So the idea of renewal in Wordsworth and one other poem. I think they may have put the other question on it, so we ignore the question at the top. Question is, so it's question 11. It's the typed script B, which I've read through. And then just as a final activity, so we've said we certainly want candidates to have a critical stance. We've said we want them to move beyond just doing word level. We've said we want a sense of a meaningful use of context. What level or what mark do we feel script B may have achieved? And understandably, I'm giving a few extra minutes. It's a very long response. Possibly with a typed candidate, they've potentially had some additional time. No problem, Pearson. I know obviously everyone's really busy at this time of year, so just give it a little skim. And sometimes, if we're not sure, we might want to ask ourselves, what could we particularly or possibly expect from a candidate at this stage in the time that we give them with our task? So it may be that possibly we're not necessarily looking for perfection, but thinking about where we're placing it. It certainly focuses on renewal throughout. The contexts are also handled quite skillfully. It may appear like quite a light touch, but the contexts run throughout the essay. They run the whole way through, potentially in some areas seemingly light touch, but it's that idea of making them relevant or significant. So they are sort of referenced throughout. The idea of the meaningful linking. Where we're not sort of asking for straight out comparison. They're often using each poem to kind of illuminate a point with the other poem. Yeah, so we're thinking 5. We're thinking there's certainly critical evaluation. Anyone else? Are we in agreement to 5? And if so, where might it end up? I mean, I do appreciate it's a long answer. It takes a long time to work our way through it. Yes, so possibly thinking quite heavy with language, so feeling not as evaluative, so possibly 4. So if we're finding, because it is quite tough, isn't it, when we look at something for the first time and we're sort of working under pressure, if we're finding it quite hard to place, would it sort of surprise? In fact, if I sort of show you the sort of the mark first, and then if it is sort of surprising, I'll sort of take through and sort of take you through the thinking of the mark, and then hopefully that might clarify. Because we have, as we said, we've been talking throughout about making sure we're trying to interweave those contexts, making sure we're not too heavy on word level, and making sure we've got this grasp of a critical stance. Some points raised there saying maybe possibly thinking 4. But this piece, in terms of where it was, they felt in senior team, this is clearly a 5. And not only that, but high in 5. We are looking at something that they felt met the criteria. So certainly length and angles taken, we have sort of sustained. We'll look at, because I know some people have raised an issue about whether it's critical or evaluative not, but certainly they felt this was met. They felt that there is certainly a sophisticated understanding of craft. And again, I'll go through and unpick some of it because due to the length of the answer, it sometimes can be overlooked. Contextual factors, and I did mention that there's an interweaving of them. So sometimes we might not spot them on a first read. We might not sort of appreciate them on a first read. And the contextual factors in text and context was actually sort of throughout the response. Now, the one I think that maybe some of you may find a sticking point, but we'll have a look for it. This candidate perhaps didn't put AO5 front and center. They perhaps, didn't always clearly flag the idea of other interpretations, other readings. But even where they didn't name a particular critical interpretation, they certainly considered the variety of critical interpretations. And that would be why this response did actually score highly. It scored sort of secure. They felt this was a candidate who did everything we would expect them to do. And it's this idea that answers do not have to be perfect. And there could be things that, as teachers, as assessors, we might want to see that maybe we feel the student didn't do, or maybe felt a slight imbalance. But if we just have a look, we'll sort of try and think of and see why this one may have been felt that it did enough to get those full marks, essentially. So they do begin, we might feel that they're using particular words and maybe suggesting things without covering, but the very first sentence does really confidently grasp the concept of renewal. And they talk about their understanding of renewal will be. They sort of define it for us. So the idea of renewal, and not only that, but this idea of contemplation and how it's capable of yielding things. They begin with the idea that there is a connection made between the Wordsworth, which was the question poem, and then the poem they've selected, which was Sonnet of the Sea. Certainly the student has a confident grasp of language. So in terms of their AO1 and how they're expressing their ideas, they certainly show confidence. They do mention things that sometimes we're not realizing could be awarded as AO2. So it's interesting to sort of think about those and track them through the response. So beginning with an overall view on setting, they then move into discussing the position they feel both of these writers take, and they suggest it's a shared position of weariness at the excesses of society. Where they do use those quotes, they are sort of pairing them, if we like. So they're providing the proof, if you like, for the connection through those paired selections. The sense that they talk about the context of the urban society and this universal concern of the Romantics. So we must remember that the context point, it may not always look like someone clearly sort of saying, here is a wider context. And in fact, what the student is doing is they're making context work for their answer. They're constantly aware of the wider context of the Romantic movement. They're thinking about how these two poets relate to or speak to each other in terms of their literary positions. And they then move on and look at this idea, because I know we mentioned the idea of language, but in fact, what the student is doing by making occasionally these longer quotes, they're not necessarily just doing word level. They're thinking about how the mood and the overall tone is created. So what we might initially think is a lack of precision, as we go through, it's not a lack of precision, it's actually the candidate making those meaningful connections and showing that they've got a very sophisticated grasp of what the two poems are about. And that's the danger with these questions, because we sometimes think we might want to see this sort of spot effect, but in fact, that would sort of limit the candidate. This candidate has a clear grasp of what they're trying to say about renewal and nature. They do make a contrast of form in terms of Keats's direct address. They do talk about Wordsworth's ideas of poetry, and don't forget that in itself will be his own critical interpretation of his own work. So we mustn't forget that that can be an aspect of AO5, even if it is the poet's own wider view. We look through then at the sense of drawing those similarities, so seeing similarities in terms of imagery, and the sense that some techniques such as juxtaposition and the rhyme doing a job, so actually looking at what the rhyme is doing at that particular point. They're looking at renewal throughout, so they never lose sight of the question. It is a long answer. And they are making reference to these contextual features, even if they're not always saying here is a romantic feature. So, for example, we have sublimity of nature, which is another AO3 context. They then draw the point through personification. They look at the writer's perspective, he's presenting himself drawing renewal from transcendence, then they compare it across to Keats. So they see a slight difference with Keats in terms of descriptive rather than philosophical. And they carry on with this comparison. So this is where we're seeing critical interpretation with that small c. So we're not necessarily having a critic says, but the candidate has become the nuanced critic. The candidate is drawing these points through, and they're showing that they have sort of a grasp of the wider critical field. We do have a few examples of word use and word quotes, but think about what they're doing. They're not just doing word level analysis. It's actually drawing to a larger point about hyperbole. So it's not that simple. This word means this, which is what we mean with word level analysis. It comes back to the idea of worldview. And again, we might balk at the word worldview, but it is an example of AO3 context. So we're looking at this as one that gained the marks because this is someone who has done their critical reading. They've kind of immersed themselves in the context, and they're not listing context. They're not saying this is this and this is this. They've got it underpinning the entire work. And it's the idea that it runs through, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to find and identify, but it's because it's the whole way through the piece and the candidate has kind of subsumed it into their own cogent arguments. There's perhaps a sense that towards the end they thought, I best look at form, I best look at an explicit AO5. But again, they're not just listing it. They're trying to say something about the schemes. They're trying to perhaps suggest there's a difference there between the perspectives. And yes, as we said, we are not expecting perfection. There is perhaps a sense the candidate thought, I best stick in M.H. Holland's view. But overall, they've done more than we would expect or anticipate in the time allowed, and even with, if we assume there might be some extra time here, and we have to award what's there, not what's not there. So we felt that certainly this is a candidate who's showing a critical engagement, and you'll see one's better than this. It's this idea of it can still have things that we maybe would change or possibly improve or develop, but it can still gain the 25 out of 25, can still gain the full marks. And it's sort of an important thing to bear in mind. So as we said, particularly with this task where they're asked to look at possibly two very different poets, but linked by a literary movement, it's that idea of building the critical argument. And this candidate has a clear view of their critical argument. And there may be points where we may have liked them to flag certain things in a more obvious or explicit fashion, but the points are there. And the interpretations are there. If we say maybe perhaps the AO5, we have to unpick a little bit more, but it is there, and even just be watching out for it. So for example, Wordsworth's comments on his own work also are relevant, so that would count. And it's an interesting script to look at, because as we said, it's quite long, which can make it hard to assess. There's perhaps ways we would like them to have maybe done things a little bit differently. There is perhaps a sense that there's been a quick memory at the end of the essay, or I must say something about form, or I must put in another critic. But we mustn't, we're not here to take away or to punish. We're here to say, what has the candidate achieved? What have they done? And this response you will see better, and they will still sort of get that mark. They're normally going beyond the scheme, but certainly, they have done enough to meet the criteria for level 5 and to meet it securely. So it's to give us a little bit of hope in terms of how we're guiding our own students as well. It's the critical engagement that's key, then being informed with those other AOs. And obviously we talked today about how to maybe foreground them. And with that candidate, maybe if we had a bit more time and a bit more work, we'd talk to them about foregrounding their AO5 in particular. But that's not to say that that essay is still not worth those marks, and it did, and it was awarded that accordingly. So again, the sense of the notional plus full marks, so it's the sense that, personally, we might have said final bits, don't just stick on the critic and maybe put some more AO5 explicit interpretations in. But it's the sense that, we don't want perfection. This is the notional plus. It could be more than 25, and there will be ones that will go even further. And it possibly might intimidate others. It possibly might, as you say, stimulate a discussion. Your candidates might say, I would do this differently, or I would do other things with it. But certainly the candidate is definitely engaged with these texts, and they definitely are showing nuance. Even if, we maybe feel still there is maybe a slight imbalance across. So looking then at where we are at, we're trying to get beyond 1, 2, and 3. We're trying to get sort of past the idea of visiting or gracing the text or simply reviewing it. At 3, we hope at least that everyone is able to identify and explain their features, although what may be keeping a candidate as 3 might be if they're still being quite linear or not making those secure connections, particularly with the contexts. At level 4, this keyword that I would use is discrimination. So we don't necessarily want every detail, but we think about how a particular detail is going to help a response or help an argument towards certain key terms in the question. Students are looking more closely at things, but they're also able to take a large zoom out as well. They're also able to look at larger structural or generic features, and they are trying to evaluate. And again, maybe, as we said, that past answer, we had to dig a bit for some of the evaluation in places, but that doesn't sort of stop it. At level 5, we have scrutiny and overview. So sometimes, as you say, what possibly we think was just analysis actually is sort of overview, and it's engaging and stimulating. There's secure methodology. There's sort of a secure idea driving the response and a sense of discursive purpose. So there is a sense, there is an exploration, and there is a seeking out of those connections. As we've said, we've got our linear and modular routes that you may pursue with candidates, and I'm sure maybe you've made some of those decisions already, but there are maybe ways of looking for candidates who maybe do require a resit. And then we're thinking of the scripts. And as we said, the scripts today, there was the maybe safer low 5 that certainly clearly cleared the boundaries for level 4 and began to show those flashes of criticism, those flashes of evaluation. And then we have that quite interesting and maybe quite lengthy full mark answer that perhaps is not the approach we may have taken, but it's certainly doing everything we would expect a candidate to do. And it's certainly critically engaged throughout. And if we actually examine and look at and review that response, 2 or 3 more times, you can start to see actually that at AO3, AO5, it's actually interwoven throughout the whole response. So while it maybe does not always flag or trumpet itself, it is there. And the candidate is really engaging at that nuanced level, at that critical level of exploration that we're seeking for. And it's just an interesting one because it may be a little bit different to maybe how we've prepared candidates. And just in terms of support, reminding everyone that there's sort of a full range of support materials at various stages for various reasons. We have Getting Started and the training events, the subject advisor, Claire Haviland, her details are on the end of the slide, and you'll have copies of the slideshow in your delegate packs. Schemes of work are also available online, and some sample assessment materials. The examiner's reports, which give us a little guide on what to do and what to avoid, and we've been using some segments from those today. Making use of the papers, but also the mark schemes with candidates. So actually familiarising the candidates with the mark schemes and inviting them to critique them and add textual references. And then the various results support that can be tailored to school and be tailored to your own candidates and their own responses after the exam window has closed. So just a quick recap. I'm sure many people have been on the website a number of times, but just reminding us all, there's quite a lot on there and it is worth a delve every so often. It is constantly updated, and you've got not just the past papers, but you do sometimes have teaching packs for different units. For your particular groups, you have the Results Plus. So you do have the analysis tool for your cohorts, which will allow you to sort of look at performance reports for your candidates. There is also Exam Wizard, which is available, which allows people to design tasks through from past paper banks and from past schemes. And we have the access to the script portal, and that's available for others as well. And the curriculum books, there is the textbook. And as we said, Claire is a good point of contact, and you will be able to sort of look her up on both the website and onto the slideshow. And we have then places we can go and different places to start. And then at this point, I know we've done a hugely whistle-stop tour of various things. Yes, the question A was 21 and the final one was full. Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you for joining us. I know everyone is very busy at the moment, so I hope you have a good day. And yes, sorry, Monique. I think Fielson's giving you the mark. That was 21 for A and full for B. So B, even though we maybe had a few little qualms, it did achieve the full level 5. So if you wish to send any questions through that you would like to have forwarded to Claire, I can take those from the chat box and forward them through. I would like to thank everyone again for their time. The exemplars for Hamlet, Filson, we don't have them here today, but what you could have is if you look on the website, there should be some Hamlet responses with marks. So if you go back on the website and assessment resources, there are usually some exemplar model answers available. And if not, or if there's none at the moment for recent papers, I can certainly maybe pass that to Claire and see if we can maybe get something up in the recent future. So we'll certainly do that one. So there should be some exemplars on there, and it should be covering all texts. And if we don't have a huge amount for Hamlet, I will say that it's definitely one that's been sought after quite urgently. So we'll make sure we do that. And thank you again for today. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and I do appreciate it at this time of year when you have so many other tasks on. And I would like to wish you all a lovely day. And I'll just sort of sign off for now. And thanks once again. And I do appreciate you working with us and joining us at Pearson here today. So thank you and goodbye, and have a good day. Bye bye.